Of things going on. Yeah. Hello. How's it going? Good. We're just testing the mics ourselves. You know.
Chairman, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. One, two, three.
against something, so it wouldn't.
You ready? Mic check, 1, 2, mic check. Mic check for the reporter, 1, 2, mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Down to 30.
Well, do you want to make? Mic check, 1, 2, mic check. Check, 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 1, 2.
Member mic 1, 2, I'm talking louder than usual to give you a good check. 1, 2, 3, 4. Test, test, test. Test 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing, testing. Test 1, 2, 3. Witness mic 1, 2, 3. Test, test, test. Member mic 1, 2, 3. Test, test, test. 1, 2, 3.
Good. Okay, the Rules Committee will come to order. Today we are considering two measures, H.R. 2157, the Supplemental Appropriations Bill, and H.R. 986, the Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act. So I will be speaking about the first item, H.R. 2157. It's part of the majority's ongoing effort to help communities rebuild after a series of devastating floods, hurricanes, wildfires, and more. This is a priority for us. That's why in the opening days of this Congress, we passed an emergency disaster supplemental to provide more than $12 billion in relief to farmers suffering from crop and livestock issues, coastal communities rebuilding their infrastructure, and our fellow citizens in Puerto Rico. This president may not take what happened in Puerto Rico seriously, but we do. We're committed to helping them recover and rebuild. That legislation passed with bipartisan support, but unfortunately the Senate failed to act on it. So we are back today trying again to get these communities the resources that they need. The bill we are considering today would go even further by adding an additional $1.5 billion for the Army Corps to rebuild projects damaged by natural disasters, and an additional $1 billion for the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Relief Program. With this funding, the hardest hit communities could rebuild damaged housing, businesses, and infrastructure. Lastly, this bill will also provide $500 million in funding for the Emergency Conservation Program to help our farmers and our ranchers. It's frustrating to see impacted communities being told to hurry up and wait by the Senate as their proposal languishes, because they can't wait. Americans are struggling. They desperately need to rebuild. It is long past time. They got the assistance from Congress that they need. Another bipartisan vote for disaster aid will hopefully encourage our friends on the other side of the Capitol to get their act together on this and get the job done. With the second item, H.R. 986, this majority is taking action once again to protect Americans' health care. And we need to act now because the President has taken a key part of the Affordable Care Act and turned it on its head. This law's state innovation provision was designed to do exactly what Democrats and Republicans talk about all the time. Let states be the laboratory of new ideas, in this case to expand health coverage. Today, states just have to meet some pretty fundamental criteria along the way, ensure that no consumers are dropped from coverage, lose benefits, or face higher costs. You've really got to hand it to this administration, and I don't mean that as a compliment, because now it is trying to use the same provision to take away people's health care. They have issued revised guidance to try and do an end run around Congress as they keep trying to chip away at the ACA's benefits. So if the administration is successful here, older Americans and people with pre-existing conditions like cancer and diabetes would be at risk for paying more for their health care. Others could lose their coverage altogether. It would be catastrophic, but this majority is not going to let that happen without a fight. So H.R. 986 would uphold the true intent of this provision by stopping HHS and the Treasury Department from carrying out this updated guidance. And it will send another message to the White House that this Democratic Congress is going to be a brick wall against any attempt at taking people's health care away. Before we hear our witnesses, let me turn to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks that he would like to make.
I just want to note for the record, Mr. Chairman, that it was you that called the Democratic Conference a brick wall, not me. So just want that on the record. Seriously. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're here today on two bills, the first of which is a supplemental disaster appropriations bill that members on both sides of the aisle desire to see enacted into law. Last Congress, when Republicans were in the majority, we passed a disaster relief package through the House, but it wasn't brought up in the Senate. Earlier this Congress, another promising disaster relief package got caught up in partisan politics when the Democratic majority attached a controversial rider to the package. And while I'm pleased that my friends are continuing the conversation on providing much-needed disaster relief, and I'm likely to support this bill, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out my disappointment that this could very well be another one-house exercise. Importantly, as we move forward, we must include protections against the $250 million for social services block grants from being used to fund abortions. Negotiations are happening right now between the administration and Congress about how to resolve these differences and advance a bill that could finally end the suffering of so many communities. I hope the Democratic majority will focus on making law to provide essential disaster relief rather than just passing a bill. I also hope all members of the House will have the opportunity to amend this bill and to make their preferences known. I encourage this committee to make as many amendments in order as possible to give members, both Democrats and Republicans, a chance to have their priorities heard and considered. For our second bill today, the majority's brought up yet another piece of legislation that will go nowhere in the Senate and has no chance of being signed into law. Unfortunately, this bill is extraordinarily misnamed and misleading. The majority is calling this a bill to protect Americans with pre-existing conditions. However, there is no real connection between the promise of the title and what the bill actually achieves. In fact, that may be the reason there are 7 amendments which would retitle the bill more appropriately. H.R. 968 is a very short bill that blocks single regulation regarding Section 1332 waivers. Waivers that exist with a proven track record of success in reducing premiums for those shackled to Obamacare. Nothing in this bill protects people with pre-existing conditions, and nothing in the bill changes anything in the law regarding pre-existing conditions. In fact, the regulation this bill is supposed to stop explicitly maintains the same protections for people with pre-existing conditions consistent with current law. So the entire bill is counterproductive but consistent with the Democratic goals of a Washington-centric, one-size-fits-all government-run healthcare system. Instead of allowing states to be the laboratories of democracy, this bill advances the notion that Washington always knows best. If the majority is serious about protecting people with pre-existing conditions, then I say again that Republicans are ready and willing to work with them in a bipartisan manner to achieve that goal. In fact, our record in this Congress proves that ongoing commitment to protecting Americans with pre-existing conditions. The very first measure Republicans proposed this year on the first day of the new Congress was to amend the rules package to require the committees of jurisdiction to report legislation that guarantees no American can be denied coverage or charged higher premiums as a result of pre-existing condition. Democrats voted that down. On April 2nd, we tried again, this time to make in order H.Res. 280, a resolution requiring Congress and the administration to work together to protect Americans with pre-existing conditions, to lower premiums, reduce drug prices, and to strengthen Medicare and employer-provided coverage. Democrats again opposed that measure. Despite these setbacks, Republicans are still ready and willing to work on a real bipartisan solution to protect people with pre-existing conditions. If Democrats truly wanted to accomplish that goal for the American people, they should propose something different than this deceptive messaging bill that isn't going anywhere. Regardless of whether Democrats choose to do something real and achievable, Republicans are ready and willing to work to increase access to and lower the cost of health care. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cole, and I appreciate your comments. I just want to say, I remind everybody that people with pre-existing conditions are protected because of the Affordable Care Act. And the reason why we are moving forward on legislation is because the administration is working overtime to try to take that protection away. And so, you know, the fact that the people have these protections is not because of the Republicans who have repeatedly and consistently tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act outright. But in any event, I'm happy to be here with our witnesses, and I want to, on H.R. 986, which the bill will begin with here, I want to welcome the Honorable Frank Pallone, Jr., the Chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and Mr. Griffith, who will be testifying on behalf of the Republicans. We're delighted that you are here. Anything that you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. I'm happy now to recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Turn your mic on, Frank. There you go.
Oh, thanks, Elsie. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the members of the committee. I'm going to submit my full statement for the record,
Without objection.
But try to summarize. This bill, I call it the Pre-Existing Conditions Act, H.R. 986, is part of a package that I believe you'll be considering this week and next that seeks to basically lower health care costs and protect Americans with pre-existing conditions and address the Trump administration's sabotage of the Affordable Care Act. The one bill, I think there's maybe other bills that are on the suspension calendar this week. This is the one that's before the Rules Committee for this week. And I don't think I have to tell anyone that the Trump administration obviously has tried to repeal and still supports repeal of the ACA through their judicial pronouncements, but at the same time is using every regulatory trick in the book to try to undermine and sabotage the ACA, by expanding junk plans that are not subject to consumer protections, by gutting spending on outreach so people don't even know, what's available in the marketplace. But in my opinion, one of the most egregious things that they've done is with regard to Section 1332 waivers. In other words, what was in the original ACA, and I was one of the drafters of it, was that there was an effort to give states the opportunity to experiment with health insurance reforms that could improve the well-being of residents. There hasn't been a lot of focus on this over the last 7 years, but there were many things in the ACA that were designed to try to innovate, experiment, do kind of test programs to see if they worked and maybe would improve things. But under 1332, if there was going to be a waiver that, allowed you to make changes and not do what was clearly, set forth in the ACA, then the states had to show that they were going to maintain affordability, that it was still going to have comprehensive coverage, and that the same number of people would be insured. So basically, you could start to sell insurance in the marketplace that might be a little different as long as you maintained affordability, you had comprehensive coverage, and you kept the same number of people insured. Now, when the president came in, President Trump, he issued guidance, which in my opinion just totally violates the law. I don't know how else to say it. It is totally inconsistent with the law. And as a result of the guidance, states now are allowed to issue plans that basically say that as long as you have access to insurance that's affordable and comprehensive, and that you don't have to actually, you can offer insurance that in other words, they don't have to keep track of how many people actually get it. It's just that you have access to it. And as a consequence, this access requirement has resulted in the number of people that are actually insured dwindling because they may have access, but they don't actually have the insurance. And at the same time, it has increased costs, it has reduced coverage, and people with pre-existing conditions are the most that actually suffer, right? Because if you have a pre-existing condition, then, and you don't get comprehensive coverage or you're charged more, you might as well not have the insurance at all. It doesn't necessarily help you with your pre-existing condition because many people with pre-existing conditions need to have a certain level of coverage, they need to have a comprehensive coverage, and it's got to be affordable. So what we're doing in this legislation, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, is basically reversing that. We're saying that you have to go back to the original intent and the clear language of 1332, which says you can't have reduced number of people with this insurance, you can't reduce the comprehensiveness of the coverage, and you can't charge more to make it less affordable. It's that simple. I don't know how else to, I'm not trying to say there's any magic here. But the other things that they have done with the guidance, that the Trump administration has done with the guidance, is they have directed the subsidies to these junk plans. So they ask for a waiver, and the waiver has all these harmful impacts, but then you can get the subsidy or you can get the tax credits, and you can actually direct people to those junk plans, if you will, those plans that don't accomplish the goal. And more people are buying them thinking that they're okay. And the other thing they do is they allow states to have flat tax credits. So as you know, under the Affordable Care Act, depending upon your income, you get more of a tax credit or less, on a sliding scale. And they say, oh, you don't have to do that anymore. You can just get a flat subsidy or a flat credit, across the board, regardless of your income. So there's so many things here that are undermined. I don't even, I don't want to go through it all. We can talk about it as you ask questions or comments. But the one thing I did want to say is this. During the Obama administration, when these waivers were granted pursuant to the law, there were some states, I think there were 7, there may be more now, that were granted the waivers because they wanted to introduce reinsurance. And I think you know that under the ACA, the reinsurance provisions, that gave states money so that they could bring new carriers into the marketplace that, that maybe weren't willing to take the risk, that ended after a couple years. And so some states decided that they wanted a waiver so that they could reinstitute reinsurance in their state. My state is one of them. And as a result of that, they got the waivers. This doesn't change that at all, because the reinsurance programs or the reinsurance waivers were consistent with the law. And so those are not affected in any way, because I know some have said, well, what are you doing with the reinsurance plans? And I wanted everyone to understand that. So the last thing I would say is that we have a number of groups, third-party groups that you've heard of, that are very supportive of this, because they're very concerned about patients with pre-existing conditions that are negatively impacted by those waivers. And I won't go through the whole list, but it's the American Medical Association, the Hospital Association, the AARP, the Heart Association, a lot of the major groups that are involved with healthcare. So I'll yield back at this point.
Thank you very much. Now I want to recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith. Welcome.
It's good to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the Rules Committee today. H.R. 986 is coming to the floor Thursday, continuing a proclivity of political point scoring over advancing serious solutions. First, let me be clear. This bill has nothing to do with pre-existing conditions. Section 1332 guidance does not, I repeat, does not touch pre-existing condition protections. This bill is a political messaging bill. It makes no structural changes to improve access to or delivery of care. If Democratic members actually cared about protecting individuals living with pre-existing condition protections, they would govern and lock in these important safeguards. But since they chose to put politics above protections, Energy and Commerce Republican leader Greg Walden offered an amendment to protect patients with pre-existing conditions. The Walden Amendment provides guaranteed issue and renewability, a ban on health status underwriting, and a ban on benefit exclusions. Real pre-existing condition protections that Democrat members claim to support. The amendment is also a bill. It is a practical bill with 52 Republican co-sponsors that actually provides protections for individuals living with pre-existing conditions, which the underlying bill does not do. But instead of voting to lock in these protections, Democrats have us voting on made-for-TV bills with catchy titles. And finally, on the substance, Democrat members are simply wrong. Section 1332 waivers, known as state innovation waivers, are in fact working. Premiums have gone down in 7 states by an average of 20%. To date, 14 states have submitted waivers under Section 1332. 8 of these states have active waivers, 7 of which are used for state reinsurance programs. States have shown they can take steps under 1332 to stabilize their markets without new federal money. In fact, the pass-through funding or savings generated from the market stabilization programs can be reinvested into the program, further reducing premiums. For 2018 alone, Alaska experienced a 26% premium reduction. Minnesota saw their rate increase reduced to 11.3%, significantly less than their 2017 57% increase. And Oregon rate changes range from negative 1.6 to 14.8%, dropping to a range of 9.6 to 10.1% for 2019. All of these waivers protect pre-existing conditions, so I find it misleading that the bill authored by Democrat members before us today would limit states' opportunity to innovate, and that the bill is entitled Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act of 2019. All of these waivers protect pre-existing conditions. So we have to move forward. These waivers give states flexibility to innovate and Americans more health care choices. Democrats want to take this away, and I believe that's wrong. Now, countering their petty politics with backfire, fire meeting fire, Republicans have offered several amendments to rename the bill to reflect what legislation would actually achieve. There's the Don't Let States Innovate Act. This bill actually has nothing to do with Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act. This bill limits Health Care Choices Act. Nothing in this bill would eliminate Pre-Existing Conditions Act, and my personal favorite, the insert political punchy title that doesn't reflect the bill's substance act. Now, I believe in federalism, the very fabric of our country, so I urge opposition to this bill. A vote in support of this proposal is a vote against your constituents, your state insurance commissioner, your state legislatures, and your governors. A vote in opposition of this bill is a vote for the people and for innovation. Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, I wish we were here to work together on protecting pre-existing conditions. Sadly, this is not the case. I eagerly await a genuine opportunity to address this issue, and accordingly, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I thank you both for being here. Let me just make a quick comment and a quick question. Let me just say for the record that I think probably one of the reasons why the Democrats are in the majority and not the Republicans is this very issue. And I think the American people saw pretty clearly on dozens and dozens and dozens of occasions Republican efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act in its entirety with no exceptions and no protections for pre-existing conditions. The first time I think I've ever heard a Republican talk about protecting people with pre-existing conditions was after you lost the election. And so, forgive us if we don't believe that the real intent of now the minority is to protect people with pre-existing conditions or expand their health care protections. Mr. Pallone, the Trump administration says, don't worry, be happy, we'll protect people with pre-existing conditions, nothing to worry about. Why should we be skeptical of the administration's promise that their junk plans won't harm cancer patients, for example?
Well, you see, I think you're right on point here, which is the Republicans, and I'll use, Mr. Walden as an example, and Mr. Griffith is here kind of, representing his amendment. They say, okay, we're not repealing the section that says that you can't discriminate on pre-existing conditions, or we'll reiterate it in an amendment, right? But that doesn't mean anything, because the fact of the matter is that if you start allowing junk plans to be sold that don't cover things that people with pre-existing conditions depend on, or you allow more to be charged, right? Or you, there's so many ways to undermine that. The best example is not, and again, I hate to keep mentioning people that aren't here because it's kind of unfair, but I don't know that she would care because I've heard it so many times, was Virginia Fox. We had at least 2 or 3 times before the committee, so forgive me if she's not here. And she would say to me when I would come here, she'd say, well, in certain states, I don't know if it was her state, I think it was in North Carolina, that they, before the ACA, they were selling hospital plans that were they were selling insurance plans that were very inexpensive. They were like $50 a month. And I asked her, I said, well, what does that cover? And when she went through the list, it didn't include hospitalization. Well, to me, if I have a pre-existing condition and my hospitalization isn't covered, I don't really have insurance. I don't even consider that insurance. And her response is, well, maybe that's all you can afford, and you're not allowing us to sell this plan, so you're a bad guy because you should have a freedom to choose a $50 a month plan that doesn't have a hospitalization. I don't think I'm mischaracterizing what she said because she was being honest, that this is the person's responsibility. That's what you want, that you can have it. And we're saying that's not the case because people don't understand. They're going to go out and buy these junk plans. They're not, they may have a kidney disorder, for example, and they need certain drugs and need certain care, and they don't get it because their package doesn't include it. And then the Republicans get rid of the outreach and the marketplace and the navigators, so that you don't even know what you're buying. And this is the problem. The sabotage has to be turned around. And to just say, I'm putting words in mouth, well, we're not going to disqualify, we're not going to get rid of the thing that says you can't discriminate based on pre-existing condition doesn't mean anything if you end up with a plan that doesn't provide you with the coverage that you need. It's meaningless. Not to mention, you could rescind the plan, you could have an annual limit on the plan, you could have a lifetime limit on how much is covered. None of those things are protected by the Walden Amendment. They're just not.
And I've been here for years, and I've seen, up close and personal, my friends vote repeatedly to repeal the Affordable Care Act and replace it with nothing. Take away essential benefits protections, as well as take away protections for people with pre-existing conditions, and offering nothing in return. And so I appreciate I hope the new interest in protecting people with pre-existing conditions is real. And I think, to me, this is pretty clear. I don't know if Mr. Griffiths wanted to add anything.
Well, I would just say that the bill that we passed out of the House did in fact have language in it that said that you couldn't take away pre-existing conditions, and I talked about it on the campaign trail. Maybe others should have done likewise.
Yeah, but
and I would say,
repeat, I've been here when vote after vote after vote after vote after vote, repeal and nothing. So
well, we passed a bill out of the House.
Coming late to the game, and I appreciate it, but I think we don't want to weaken the protections we have. Quite frankly, we want to build on the Affordable Care Act. We don't want to weaken it.
And if I might, Mr. McGovern, we have some significant issues that need to be dealt with, and that's why I said at the end of my comments that I want to deal with this in a genuine and earnest way to try to take an opportunity to fix it, because just before I came over here, I had some ER docs in my office, and they were talking about one of the guys also works at a clinic, and he said that he had a patient that had low platelets. They sent him to the hospital from the clinic to get tests, and with one of the insurance plans that's under the current system that we have, all of a sudden he gets a $6,000 bill because he has a high deductible. And a vast majority of my constituents have found that instead of being able to keep their doctor and being able to keep their plan and having a reduction of $2,500 for the average family, their rates have gone way up, and they've had to take their deductibles way up in order to be able to afford insurance. Even the insurance that my colleague likes, they have to pay so much for it. The deductibles are so high, the copays are so high, that they in essence feel like they have a junk plan. And so we've got to figure out a way to set aside the political differences and figure out something that we can do to help the middle-class Americans across the board in getting better health care.
I agree, but I haven't seen anything.
And this bill doesn't do that.
I haven't seen anything. Well, I think this bill makes sure we don't go backwards, which I think is really important, and I think we need to figure out ways to build on it. We had a hearing here last week on Medicare for All. I know we have big differences on it, but part of what I hear from my constituents is that while they appreciate the Affordable Care Act, in some cases they need more. Association health plans aren't going to do it, or more kind of, or allowing people to buy junk plans is not going to do it. When people get sick, they want to know they're protected and they get coverage. They want to know they're not going to go bankrupt if they get an illness. They want those guarantees, and we ought to be figuring out how we make the healthcare system in this country better for everybody, more affordable, more cost effective. But nobody should have to decide between going to see a doctor, or pursuing treatment for an illness and having to worry whether to go bankrupt.
And that's the problem with that $6,000 copay.
But I will tell you, it is better under the Affordable Care Act. It was much worse beforehand, and I don't want to go backwards. So I appreciate you being here, and I'll yield to Mr. Hastings.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Griffith, there are 130 million Americans and nearly 8 million Floridians with pre-existing conditions, and I'm one of them. Although the Trump administration's short-term, limited duration insurance plans, those of us that are politicking this thing call them junk plans, they technically forbid insurers from denying coverage based on an individual's health history. Isn't it true that these junk plans have loopholes that would allow discrimination against people with pre-existing conditions to flourish? And my question to you is, how does this administration's limited duration insurance plans place those with pre-existing conditions in danger of facing higher health costs and less coverage.
And I'm not specifically familiar with that, but I will tell you that under 1332 waivers, they can't do that. And if somebody's doing that under that waiver, then we need to bring that to the attention of the administration, because the administration has been very clear that they are going to make sure that people with pre-existing conditions have access to health care and health insurance.
All right. Mr. Pallone, last week on ABC News, President Trump's acting White House Chief of Staff and Director of the Office of Management and Budget, our former colleague, Mr. Mick Mulvaney, claimed that, and I quote him, "Every single plan that this White House has ever put forward since Donald Trump was elected covered pre-existing conditions." Continuing the quote, continuing on to say that the debate about pre-existing conditions is over. I watched him on television say that. Both parties support them, he says. In my view, this is extremely misleading. So how has this administration's final rule promoting these junk plans put Americans with pre-existing conditions, including cancer, pregnancy, Alzheimer's, to name just a few, how does it put them at risk of simply not being offered insurance coverage?
Well, because, and I guess I sound like I'm repeating myself, but they don't specifically repeal the provision in the ACA that says that you can't discriminate because of pre-existing conditions, okay? But practically speaking, that's what happens, because what is the situation with the person with the pre-existing condition, right? Oftentimes, they need a lot more care, right? They need, they don't have a lot of money, right? So what do? So now they're offered a junk plan that doesn't include certain things that they don't realize will not be covered until they go to the hospital or a doctor and need that, right? They'll buy the cheaper plan because it is cheaper. They tend not to, if you have a pre-existing condition, a lot of times that is a huge financial burden on you. You don't have as much money as you used to have, right? And then, these plans are charging women more than men. They're charging older people more. So, again, if you're older, you're more likely to have a lot of these pre-existing conditions. So just saying we're not repealing the prohibition on discrimination based on pre-existing conditions doesn't really help you much. And that's my point. I mean, I don't know how you have to look at this practically. But beyond that, they're specifically violating the law in terms of saying that you don't have to have the same level of affordability, you don't have to have the comprehensive coverage. All those things are required for these waivers. And all we're doing is saying you can't get around that. That's all this bill does.
Yeah. I shouldn't personalize this, but I'm being treated at the Lombardi Cancer Center here in Washington. And when I go there for chemotherapy or radiation, I see literally in the time since October, my working with them, I've seen hundreds of people come there, and I've seen people leave crying because they were not covered and thought that they were. It is a regrettable set of circumstances, and I would that, unrelated to anything having to do with this particular day, a bill that we're dealing with, I just wish that everybody had the same insurance that I have. And it would seem to me that the 435 of us here in the House of Representatives ought to all have that same kind of attitude, rather than bickering back and forth about what's needed. We need to be locked up here and come together and make a determination as to what's best for the American public and how best we might provide for everyone to have more than access, but have really insurance that's beneficial to them. I'm running up right now. I calculated just this past Thursday, $230,000. It's no way on earth that I would have been able to afford that had it not been for the Affordable Care Act in the final analysis. And so I'm a staunch supporter of expanding the act and not getting rid of it, particularly when my colleagues, as Ms. McGovern has said, repeatedly have come forward, with the exception of Dr. Burgess and a couple of other people that did file measures that offered particular plans. But otherwise, it was repealed and nothing would replace. And that's regrettable. And we need to stop it and get on with the business of really doing what we know we can do, and that's provide adequate provisions for health for all Americans. And that's what's critically needed. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ranking Member Cole.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I just want to say for the record, it's good to see my friend here today. Glad you're here. I want to make, Mr. Griffin, I only have two questions, but I'm going to make a couple points as predicate, if I may, because I just think they're important for the record. You know, supposedly this is legislation because our friends are worried about protection for pre-existing conditions being unfolded. So I just want to point out for the record, on opening day, ranking members Walden, Brady, and myself actually attempted to amend the rules package to require the committees of jurisdiction to report legislation that would guarantee protection for pre-existing conditions. That was defeated by our Democratic friends, 233 to 197. In April, Dr. Burgess attempted to amend another rule to make an order ranking members Walden and Brady's resolution require Congress and the administration to work together to protect Americans with pre-existing conditions. That was defeated by Democrats, 231 to 191. In speaking about this issue, CMS Administrator Seema Verma said that Trump's administration new guidance on 1332 waivers, quote, to be very clear, the new guidance does nothing to change the ACA's pre-existing condition protections. The protections cannot be waived, and a waiver cannot be approved that might otherwise undermine these protections. And regardless, this administration stands committed to protecting people with pre-existing conditions. Now, instead, we got another effort to fight a fight that's already over and that nobody's trying to rekindle except my friends. So am I missing something here? Is there some reason to think that the administration's used the 1332 waivers in ways to undo protection for pre-existing? Is there any action in this Congress to suggest that the minority has tried to assist in that?
None that I'm aware of, and I appreciate the question. And it's interesting that several of the speakers have indicated that they start talking about junk plans, and that's covered in a different bill. This bill doesn't have anything to do with that, unless they think that these waivers are going to somehow affect a different part. But the so-called junk plans or short-term limited duration insurance was legal and was used and was allowed under the Obama administration, and now it's become somehow a symbol of something that the Trump administration has done or allowed. But these plans were allowed. The duration and whether or not they can be renewed a certain number of times has been in dispute. But the fact that the plans existed before doesn't seem to register with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. But this bill doesn't have anything to do with that. This has to do with pre-existing conditions and 1332 waivers. And there's been no indication that a 1332 waiver applied for by a state would be approved if it took away pre-existing conditions by the administration.
I think that's the key point right there. I mean, the 1332 waivers, as I understand them, and Dr. Burgess has forgotten more about these issues than I know, but it's simply to allow states to pursue innovative strategies for providing residents access to high-quality, affordable health care while retaining the basic patient protections that are already in law under the ACA. In 7 states, and you add even better list of these facts, but 7 states have already received 1332 waivers. On average, the individual market premium has dropped 19.9% in those states. You mentioned another 14 have applied for waivers, and that's being examined right now. And so this seems to me the normal process of allowing experimentation and flexibility and just good local knowledge to take place in states, and look what the result is and see what it is, and without waiving any part of the existing law. I mean, 1332 waivers, as I recall, were part of the, that's the point. We're exercising part of the powers in Obamacare that were prescribed. And now it's, well, you can't do that because we don't trust you. We don't trust the president, who, by the way, wasn't up here during the Obamacare debate. We don't trust you. Well, I'm sorry, show me some example where they've tried to undo pre-existing conditions through a 1332 waiver. We don't see any of that. So this is a really misnamed bill. I mean, it's arguing I'm providing you protection against something nobody's trying to violate, but in the process, in my view, you'll end up limiting the ability of the administration and states, and that's the real question here. We're limiting the ability of states. Why attack the Trump administration? You're really mad at states. You don't want states to come up here and ask for waivers or ask for changes or say, I can do this better. That's, that to me, it defeats the very purpose of the law that you wrote, which allowed for 1332 waivers. So again, am I missing something here?
I don't think you are, and I agree with the comments you have made.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here and
Thank you.
defending the ability of 1332 waivers under Obamacare, which our friends appear to want to take away from legislation that they originally wrote to allow exactly that kind of waiver to take place. Mystery to me. Yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ranking Member Cole, and thank you to our panel for being here today. Chairman Pallone, I believe that health care is a right. It isn't a privilege. You don't get to watch me die on the side of the road because I'm too sick and too poor to see a doctor. We don't do that to people. We take care of them. At the same time, I think that we are working with an administration that we simply can't trust. It's trust but verify. When we continue to see the lawsuits pending to undo the Affordable Care Act, when we continue to see the erosion with the refusal to fund the high-risk pools, when we continue to see movement on allowing employers to dictate what part of medical help they're going to fund for their female employees, when we continue to allow the haves versus the have-nots to sell junk plans to someone who isn't able or doesn't have the privilege to be able to read through the legal language and understand that what they're buying really isn't going to help them pay for the basics that they need, isn't going to cover the medicine that they need for the health issue that they have, or isn't going to cover the doctor or the specialist that they need. Everyone deserves to have access to affordable health care and quality care, regardless of their pre-existing condition and regardless of their ability to pay. In 2010, the American people took a historic step forward when the Affordable Care Act became law. I have a constituent who I recently talked to, who for years had gone without health insurance until the Affordable Care Act was passed into law. Her name is Wendy, and Wendy has type 1 diabetes. And before the ACA, insurers would deny her coverage, which they can no longer do. Wendy is now on an extended medical recipient coverage in California. For Wendy and for more than 100,000 of my constituents in California's 35th Congressional District, the ACA has been a lifesaver, a lifeline. It's a way for them to be able to see a doctor and get the health care that they need and they deserve. We care about people. We don't just care for them when they're in the womb. We care for them when they're grown and old, like you and I. Through Covered California, they now have access to health care coverage through Medi-Cal or a plan on the exchange. Recently, the Trump administration revealed its intention to repeal the entire ACA. And if President Trump has his way, Wendy and many people like her would no longer have insurance. Because let's face it, insurance companies are in it to make some money. and they're going to make money where they can. And where they can is refusing to cover people with pre-existing condition and ensuring those who are more healthy and younger. This debate is more than just about numbers. I mean, we're talking about real people, like our colleague, Mr. Hastings. We're talking about real people with real issues, real healthcare issues, and they should not be denied coverage for a pre-existing condition. HR 986 will help to protect the ACA and the American people from the Trump administration's sabotage. And I am pleased to see this critical piece of legislation be considered by the Rules Committee, and I hope that we would move it forward. Anything more that you want to add, Mr. Pallone, as to the issues? States like California have been very progressive at ensuring that people of all ages have access to their health care. I remember coming to Congress and for the first time having to buy my own health insurance, not through a familiar covered California exchange, but through the DC exchange and the limited plans that I had to purchase health insurance through. Of course, I chose a plan that I thought I've always had, traditionally had. I didn't realize that my health insurance had different types of plans. Of course, I chose the cheapest option that should have been for a healthier member of Congress than someone with a pre-existing condition that needed to go to the doctor more often. So yes, I did have a higher family deductible. That wasn't the right plan for me. And it wasn't until the second year that I actually read through all of the documents and figure out which plan was best for me. So part of our duty is to ensure that people are understanding what they're buying.
Absolutely, and that's part of the problem, which is going to be addressed in the legislation that I think you'll get next week, because the Trump administration has eliminated 90% plus of the outreach and the navigators and all those things. People don't understand what they're buying when their states pursue these waivers. I mean, I'm trying not to repeat, but progressive states, California, New Jersey, right? They've used these 1332 waivers in a positive way, because the idea was that you could experiment, but you couldn't make things less affordable, less comprehensive, or have fewer numbers of people insured. So they applied and used my state for a reinsurance waiver because that wasn't available anymore under the ACA. Now that meets these criteria, because what you're doing with a reinsurance waiver is trying to get more carriers into the marketplace, because you may only have one or two and you want to have three or four, right? And so you lower the risk for those carriers. They come in, they're still offering the comprehensive coverage, they're still offering an affordable product, and you're not decreasing, you're increasing the number of people that can get insurance, because you bring more carriers in, they're more competitive, but still within those that regulatory framework, and you accomplish the goal. It's an experiment, if you will, or a waiver that accomplishes the goal. But if you're in a state that decides to ask for a waiver and allows you to, eliminate coverage for maternal health or God forbid, hospitalization, then it doesn't meet the goal, because it's not comprehensive coverage anymore. So that's all we're saying here. You can say you don't want to get rid of this, you still want to eliminate discrimination based on pre-existing conditions, but it's kind of meaningless if you're going to now offer a policy that doesn't provide what the person needs. It's meaningless.
It's meaningless if I am a young woman and I need a yearly pap smear and I need to get access to birth control pills or birth control period, and I am denied that coverage because this Congress has decided that my employer could deny me those benefits. That to me, it is not what the Affordable Care Act is about. It is about ensuring people for the types of insurance that they need or health care that they need. In California, this is what I hear from the insurance companies. The instability of this administration is causing them, to have to look for ways to insure now and protect themselves for the future because they don't know what's looming with the next Congress. What is the next vote? If we voted 64 times to repeal the ACA, are they going to be successful one of those 64 times? And then what? Do we start from the bottom again? It doesn't make sense. With that, I will yield back to Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've got to shift gears with Mr. Pallone here. I'm thinking back to Virginia Fox's days up here on the Rules Committee. I'm used to them.
By the way, she's a good friend.
As of us all, and we send her in when we've got to get the job done. They used to send Frank Pallone in to defend the indefensible. Right? You're so good. Whenever I saw you sitting at the table, I knew we were in for a day. Now that you're holding sway over the committee that has more jurisdiction than any other committee in the House, save the Rules Committee, of course, then I've got to prepare for that. And candidly, I hope we'll see more of that. The issue that Mr. Griffith brought up about having left the word deductible out of the coverage for emergency room care in the ACA, such that when I present myself in an emergency room, yes, I have to be treated by the out-of-network doctor, and yes, I get to pay the out-of-network copay, but no, because my out-of-network deductible has no money in it and is twice as high as my in-network deductible, I virtually get zero care at the emergency room. All of those hospital expenses go uncovered. That's something we could be working on together.
Yes, sir.
We could absolutely be working on that together.
Well, we are actually, just so you know, I don't mean to judge you, but we do intend to address the surprise billing, and it will be bipartisan.
Oh, and I don't impugn the committee. I'm saying that we in the Rules Committee, you could have been bringing those fixes before the committee.
Well, they'll come, you'll see, later down the road. We have to go through regular order.
That's right. And sadly, regular order has become whatever the pokey bill of the week is. I appreciate Mr. Griffith mentioning all the amendments to retitle the title. The chairman was wrong, and I wish he was still here. He was right when he said a lot of elections were won over misleading people on pre-existing conditions. They were. There's not a local Republican left in my jurisdiction. But he was also wrong when he said nobody started talking about pre-existing conditions on the Republican side of the aisle until after the election. I'm not talking about leaders like Dr. Burgess. I'm not talking about leaders who are pushing the main risk pool model. I'm talking about 1996 when Newt Gingrich, a fellow Georgian, was leading this Congress, and we outlawed pre-existing conditions for the 130 million plus Americans on ERISA plans, right? We have come together and done this before, and it's become so bad, the mistrust in this institution, it rolled off the chairman's lips like it was nothing to suggest that Republicans have never cared about pre-existing conditions and never uttered a word about them. Notwithstanding the fact that the 130 million Americans on Medicare and Medicaid have always been protected from pre-existing conditions. And the 130 plus a million Americans on ERISA plans have been protected from pre-existing conditions since 1996. And I just wonder how we're going to solve those issues. The real irony for me is Dr. Burgess and I were sitting up here last week for the Medicare for All hearing. We may have taken on the pre-existing conditions mantra. You all have taken on the repeal and replace mantra, right? Let's repeal that ACA and replace it now with Medicare for All.
I didn't say that.
You should have been here for our hearing.
I wasn't.
We should have called you as an expert witness. We could absolutely be doing those things together, and I want to ask you sincerely, and maybe you can give me an answer, and maybe you can't understand your limitations. There's not one fiber of my being that believes that the passage of this bill is going to bring you and me as members of the United States House of Representatives closer to solving one single problem that you and I have heard from our constituents that we are absolutely committed together to solve. We will pass this bill. I will vote no, and you will vote yes. But we won't bring ourselves any closer to solving problems, in my opinion. But you've got the awesome responsibility of actually, through regular order, making the rubber hit the road. Is it your core belief that to get to the important things that you and I want to get to, this is one of those building blocks, telling the state of Georgia, where again, Democrats won the state house seat in my district, won the state Senate seat in my district, down there under the gold dome in Georgia, legislating, telling the folks from Georgia that we care more about protecting Georgians from pre-existing conditions here than they do there. I don't believe it, but do you?
Well, look, I don't want to repeat again. I think that the Trump's 1332 waiver guidance is totally inconsistent with the Affordable Care Act, and that's what we're trying to change here. And I think that if this bill were to become law, it would change it. I mean, the problem, that I think you're raising is a political one. I was hoping that, on the Senate, you're right. I think this bill will pass the House, and the question is whether the Senate takes it up. There was a time in the last session of Congress when there were those on the Republican side in the Senate, like, my counterpart, Lamar Alexander, who were working to basically put forward bills that are very similar to this and the package that you're going to get next week. It's almost word for word. But, at some point, the Republican leadership, I guess Senator McConnell and the president, it wasn't, I guess it wasn't, it was the president, or maybe it was even before that. McConnell just said, we're not going to do that. And they decided they wanted to just repeal the ACA or pursue repeal in the courts. So I keep hoping that at some point, the Republican leadership decides that the ACA is here to stay, and, we want to stabilize it and make it work as much as possible. But, we don't seem to be there. I'm always willing to work, but if you're asking me if this bill were signed into law, it would preclude the president from doing what he's doing, it would. But I don't know I don't know why he keeps pursuing this repeal policy in the courts. I don't know why McConnell doesn't want to bring these things up. I can't answer that.
That's the mistrust that I'm talking about. I tell every town hall meeting I can, President Obama led the debate on pre-existing conditions in the individual market. Congress solved it in the ERISA market in '96, but he led the debate in the individual market, and he won. Right? That decision's not coming back. He won. He persuaded America. We're all on board. You folks, to read this legislation, you just don't think that with your leadership and the president's leadership, you were as successful as you were. There's just no set of circumstances that the governor of Georgia is going to sign a bill into law that disadvantages Georgians. I just don't know how foolish folks believe that state legislatures and governors are. I think this is a settled issue in America. What are we going to do about pre-existing conditions for families that are affected? And I value as much latitude as possible to make that happen, because I do think we'll do things differently in Georgia. If you've not looked, we have the Hope Scholarship in Georgia. We're keeping more of our young talent at home. We're the only ones in the country who are doing it, but we tried it, and it worked. Free tuition for everybody who works hard and applies themselves in high school, and it's a wonderful program. We will move further when my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle are able to see how successful they were at leading the debate on pre-existing conditions in the individual market, taking that freedom away from states who were moving too slowly, and making that the law of the land. Mr. Griffith, if this bill does not pass, how many Americans will lose their pre-existing conditions coverage?
I don't believe any will lose their coverage, and in fact, I believe in states that try some new innovative measures, some may actually get insurance who don't currently have insurance because of the high cost of health insurance and the high copays, et cetera. And so I believe that if this bill were to pass and become law, it just gets in the way of states finding innovation and blocks the federalism where states can come up with ideas. You mentioned the Hope Scholarships in Georgia. That was an innovative idea. I wish we'd have thought of it in Virginia before y'all got to it, but we didn't. But it's and then what happens in a lot of these cases is if they find that something works in one state, it gets more people good quality insurance, guess what's going to happen? It's going to spread to the other states. And that was part of the genius of the concept that the American Republic came up with, was to allow the states the ability to experiment. And in the original Obamacare Act, that's what 1332 waivers were supposed to stimulate. And now what apparently this bill says is that, well, only if you do it within parameters that we absolutely approve of, you know, from 5 years ago or 4 years ago or 6 years ago, and things change. And to say that the President of the United States, whomever it may be, can't, after being petitioned by a state, and as you pointed out, the state has to approve it. It's not like you've got to, you know, in a vacuum, the President just says, we're going to try something in Florida. The state has to ask for that waiver. It has to be reviewed. The President has said repeatedly, nobody's going to get a waiver on pre-existing conditions. And so it's, you know, I don't think it'll ever become law, but should it become law, it actually just, I think, gets in the way of states that want to come up with something creative and try that idea out in one state, and then if it's successful, let it spread to the other states. And we've already seen that it's working in several states, which is why I think you have more applications under 1332. And we should continue that process of innovation at the state level, operating under our federalism concepts, and allow that to move forward and not lock in any administration and say, well, you can't do it unless you do it only the way that we like it done.
I appreciate what you all do on the committee. Again, you got more jurisdiction than anybody else,
Except y'all.
Save us. And it's an amazing workload. I agree with the chairwoman. Risk pools have absolutely gone unfunded. We could absolutely partner to do better there. The absence of including deductibles with the copay for emergency care, we can do better there. There are so many things that we can do better on. I remind folks back home, the president signed 8 different bills that changed the Affordable Care Act in an effort to do better. To take things away that weren't working and to shore things up that we could do better. That's when Republicans were leading the Congress.
And in fairness, we have some bills percolating that the chairman mentioned of the Energy and Commerce Committee. We have some bills percolating that are going to make some positive changes that are going to be bipartisan. And I just wish we were doing that. And my role here today is to say this bill isn't going to be one of those. It's not going to help. But there are some that are going to help, and the chairman is working with people of all persuasions on both sides of the aisle to try to make some positive changes.
I hope it doesn't get to be too late. You know, we poison a lot of wells here in this institution, and to suggest that when I vote no on a bill that will take away Georgia's opportunity to do what New Jersey has already had the opportunity to do, though in an even bolder way, if I may be so bold as to suggest we might even do it better than New Jersey did, to say that when I vote against taking away Georgia's opportunity to do that I'll be the guy who votes against protecting Americans with pre-existing conditions, that may advance the political argument. It doesn't advance our shared goal of serving the American people better, and I regret that that's the conversation we're having. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks. Dr. Pallone, thank you for bringing this bill. Obviously, I think that protecting people with pre-existing conditions, it's a civil right that they have. And, you know, listening to my friends, Mr. Cole, Mr. Woodall, Mr. Griffith, methinks thou doth protest too much, that all of their conversation about how they love protecting people with pre-existing conditions should be easy to just support this bill, because that's all it does. And so if Georgia's so great at it and all these other states are so great at it, then the support ought to be there, because this is a civil right. Folks don't ask to have pre-existing conditions. They don't ask for these injuries, and they need to be covered. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, and it is good to see 2 members of the Energy and Commerce Committee here. We had a hearing here in the Rules Committee last week that, quite honestly, should have been an Energy and Commerce hearing, and unfortunately it was not. It was a Rules Committee hearing. This was a bill to consider what's been termed a single-payer health system in this country, and of course it would have struck ERISA plans, it would have struck FEHBP, it would have struck most, if not all, of the Affordable Care Act, and put everyone into one bucket, if you will. And it was an interesting hearing. It took up most of the day, but it was hard for me because that hearing should have been in the Energy and Commerce Committee. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we will take that issue up in the committee. I hope we will treat it with the amount of seriousness that Chairman McGovern treated it here in this committee, because after all, that is what the Congress, the rest of the House looks for us to do as an authorizing committee, is to work our way through these tough issues related to healthcare, and we have a good track record. We passed the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act, which repealed the SGR, a very bad formula. We worked together, passed that bill out of committee 51-0, passed on the floor with a big bipartisan margin. Cures for the 21st century. We worked in our committee for 2 or 3 Congresses to get that right and put it together in the proper fashion. And I think we got pretty close. And it passed out of committee without a single dissenting vote and passed by a big margin on the floor of the House. So it's not to say that we can't do these big things in a bipartisan fashion, and indeed we can. But I also agree with my friend, Mr. Griffith, who's here for the ranking member of the minority today. I think, Mr. Griffith, you said that there are 8 states that have applied for and received these waivers. Is that correct? If I understand, if my notes are correct, that's Alaska, Hawaii, Maine, Maryland, Minnesota, New Jersey, Oregon, and Wisconsin who've approved state innovation waivers?
I believe that is correct.
So has anyone been contacted by the governors of those states saying, please help us? We're in terrible shape now because we have these waivers?
I've not heard of any complaints that, that these waivers have caused the governors of the states any consternation. They're usually things the governor has asked for or somebody in his team has asked for. And, it's interesting because while the title talks about pre-existing condition, the bill does not. The title's the only place you see that. And so it's just really interesting. But no, the waivers have not been a problem. And of course, the states have control of that, which is why it's perplexing that folks would think that a state, as Mr. Woodall said, that a state after this decision had been made by the country as a whole, led by President Obama on pre-existing conditions for things other than ERISA. It's really unfathomable that some state would put together a plan and ask for a waiver that did away with that. And so this is, it's really a false flag kind of situation. It's not really what the bill's about. We've got some legislation coming up, and I may agree with some of it and disagree with some of it that actually does stuff, but this bill is not one of those.
Well, Mr. Woodall made the point about not preventing his state from doing what these 8 states have done, and I would add my state to that. Mr. Pallone, I just have to ask you, when you were writing the Affordable Care Act and you came to Section 1332, the idea was that you would provide states the flexibility to innovate, correct?
Yes, but Dr. Burgess, and I'm going to refer to you as doctor, even though my friend Colorado called me a doctor. I'm not. These are the reinsurance waivers that I mentioned before. These were granted under Obama, and they were for the purpose of reinsurance, which meets the criteria of affordability, comprehensive coverage, and keeping the same number of people insured. In fact, even more people become insured because when you have a reinsurance waiver, you bring more carriers into the market, you reduce costs, more people get insured, and it's still comprehensive. So we're not taking away the ability to get a 1332 waiver if it meets the criteria that are set forth in the ACA. What we're saying is that the guidance that the Trump administration has put forward is totally contrary to the ACA, and it will allow all these awful impacts on people with pre-existing conditions.
Well, if I may, Administrator Seema Verma at the CMS National Forum on State Relief and Empowerment Waivers prepared remarks that she delivered that day. She said, quoting here, "In response to numerous state requests to help them address some of the ACA's most onerous and limiting requirements, the new guidance gives states the flexibility they need to increase choices for their citizens, promote market stability, and more affordable coverage." She goes on to say, to be very clear, the new guidance does nothing to change the ACA's pre-existing condition protections. The protections cannot be waived, and a waiver cannot be approved that might otherwise undermine these protections. And regardless, this administration stands committed to protecting people with pre-existing conditions. End
See,
quote.
I disagree with
She-
the consequence of that practically. You can say that we're not going to allow you.
Sir, it is my time. I need to go on because she added to that, again, I want to make clear that a waiver cannot undermine coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. While the new guidance creates more flexibility with respect to guardrails, the guardrails remain in force and continue to provide strong and meaningful protections. Continuing to quote, "Any state waiver will need to carefully account for any impact on the individual market risk pool and guarantee that people with pre-existing conditions continue to have access to coverage that is at least as comprehensive and affordable as before." So what's, end quote, so what's not to understand about that?
The key is the word access, right? So in other words, what she's saying and what the guidance says is, if there is a comprehensive plan out there that includes a basic, robust benefit package that the ACA requires, then that's enough. The fact that it costs more, the fact that you now are going to allow plans that don't have those comprehensive benefits and therefore are damaging to people with pre-existing conditions because they buy it, that's not protected. It all comes back to the same thing I said before, which is, you know, a state like...
I'm sorry, reclaiming my time. That just does not follow from the 3 paragraphs that I just read.
She used the term access. Access is not good enough. The fact that the plan is available that's comprehensive and that I end up being allowed to buy one that's junk and that costs less, and I buy it either because I don't know it or because I can't, you know, because it costs less and I think I might as well take that one, that's not the same thing as guaranteeing that you have the comprehensive coverage or that it is affordable.
Reclaiming my time. The waiver cannot undermine coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. I mean, it couldn't be...
It doesn't say that. It says
couldn't be
access.
It couldn't be any clearer.
It says access.
I was not there when you wrote Section 1332 of the Affordable Care Act. I was not permitted to be part of that group. I guess that was the same day you wrote the part on the Independent Payment Advisory Board that you loved so much that we finally repealed for you. You're
Well,
welcome.
thank you for that, but it wasn't
You're
in the,
welcome.
wasn't in the House bill. It was
You're
in the
welcome.
Senate bill.
But why did the 1332 waiver, why did you delay the implementation of that to January 1st, 2017? If this was a good idea, why didn't it start the same time as the rest of the Affordable Care Act started?
I don't remember that. I couldn't answer that offhand.
Well, I happen to have, I didn't
Oh,
bring
you
my
got
copy,
you got your
but I
copy.
have a Xerox copy of Section 1332. And with respect to health insurance coverage within a state for plan years beginning on or after January 1st, 2017.
My staff just mentioned to me, the reason I don't remember because it wasn't in the House bill. We didn't have 1332
Yeah,
waivers.
there was, right, the whole problem structurally with how this, and that brings me to the point I was going to make with Mr. Griffith, and thank you for bringing up all of the interesting title changes that have been suggested. I sat here at this very witness table while we considered the Senate bill that came over to the House of Representatives without a single hearing, with no regular order, and we took up the Senate bill and passed it as is because they lost a vote over in the Senate along the way and didn't feel like they could get the 60 votes for cloture any longer. But I had 18 amendments that day, and one of them was to amend the title and to take the word affordable out and substitute unaffordable with the Affordable Care Act. I was not, that amendment was not made in order, unfortunately. I hope that Mr. Griffith's amendments will be taken seriously, and at least one of those will be made in order, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
Yeah, as I've been trying to parse through this, as I understand it, the waiver, if allowed to go into effect, does allow the offer of junk plans and stripping away protections for pre-existing conditions, because when you uncouple the protections requiring comprehensive benefits and coverage for pre-existing conditions from the requirement of affordability, what you end up with is plans that fail to offer necessary coverage and have or have unaffordable coverage. So, my constituents have made it clear that they want a robust Affordable Care Act and a healthcare system that protects everyone. So, the mandate they've given me is to expand coverage and to move in that direction rather than pulling back. I don't think the argument that having access to unaffordable plans or access to plans that don't provide comprehensive coverage are what they're looking for. So with that, I would yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for coming here today. As been said before, despite this misleading name of this act, H.R. 986 does really nothing to further protections for pre-existing conditions contained in existing law. Instead, this is a bill that bars the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the Secretary of the Treasury from implementing a regulation called State Relief and Empowerment Waivers. The regulation expanded the purposes for which Section 1332 waivers can be used. The Trump administration's regulation allows states to use 1332 waivers for additional purposes to increase the availability of affordable coverage. Specifically, the regulation expands the definition of coverage to include short-term, limited-duration plans. Well, in the state of Arizona, which I am a congresswoman from Arizona, we passed, the state legislature passed a law this year. It will go into effect 90 days after the legislature adjourns. That basically extends the current maximum time for one of these short-term limited duration plans under state law from 1 to 3 years. And so there was this debate at the state level saying, oh, is this a good idea? Is this not a good idea? Do we like these short-term plans? Do we not like these short-term plans? Ultimately, the idea that these short-term plans were good was passed and signed by our governor. And as of yet, I don't think Arizona has asked for a waiver on these 1332s, but basically what was said is this gives customers more choices. More customer choices. And so, Mr. Griffith, I actually have a question for you, which I think you talked about a little bit before, is that there's been some talk here today about these short-term limited duration plans, that somehow they're junk plans. And I know critics all over the nation, including in Arizona, call them that. But I think they're just another option for patients as long as there's disclosure so patients know what they're getting and what they're not getting. And so I think you mentioned it, but weren't these plans in place before Obamacare took place?
Well, they were, before, I believe they were, but under Obamacare, they were allowed. And some people do use them. If you cannot afford to buy a plan under the so-called Affordable Care Act, or as Mr. Burgess would call it, the Unaffordable Care Act, and you're thinking that you may be able to afford it in a few months, then you may look towards one of these short-term plans. Are they ideal? I would say not. If you have the ability to get something better, then you should. But I do believe that some states have looked at that. But what's interesting is that this bill, does not directly deal with that. I'm not sure your state, has to apply for a 1332 waiver in order to do that. Mm-hmm. But certainly, that's something if your state is looking at doing it and they can show the numbers and so forth, Now, the president has said, and as Dr. Burgess pointed out, they're not going to allow that to include limiting
Right.
insurance to alleviate or eliminate people with pre-existing conditions. So that's one of the things that will have to happen. The other thing that people seem to forget is the state is at liberty to ban the plan, to ban any short duration plans. I believe New Jersey has in fact done that. It also, the states regulate these plans and make sure that they're providing something. So often when we get into this discussion, people start talking about these plans like they're fraudulent. Well, if there's fraud going on, the state monitors that and polices that, and that's one of the state's duties in these, if they have a short-term duration
Can I
plan.
just
Or a
respond?
shorter-term duration plan.
I agree, and Mr. Pallone, one second if you don't mind. The other thing I was told is that these short-term limited duration plans only account for like less than 1% of all the health plans out there, so I don't know that introducing them or allowing them under these waivers is going to make a huge difference, but Mr. Pallone.
Well, Mr. Griffin was right when he said that you don't need a 1332 waiver because, and this is part of the package that you'll probably get next week, the president issued regulations saying that you could extend these 3-month plans beyond up to 3 years, which is what Arizona's doing. They don't need a waiver for that because he's issued a separate regulation that allows it, which next week's bill will eliminate that option, all right?
Well, then you can talk about it.
But what I'm saying is the reason that I when you said choice, I mean, that's what it is. In other words, in the ACA, the idea was that we were concerned that states, I mentioned the Virginia, Fox, North Carolina plan, were allowing these, skimpy plans, some of which didn't even have hospitalization to be sold, and people were buying them because they, in many cases, thought they were more robust and comprehensive, and I think didn't know what they were getting into. So the danger is now, because of the president's separate regulation, Arizona can do what they did. But the only reason that these 3-month waivers, these 3-month plans or short-term plans were in the ACA was because, if somebody loses their coverage and they can't get coverage again, they'd have something for the 3 months. But I would clearly say that allowing, as the president has by regulation, to those to be sold for up to 3 years, I think is a direct violation of the ACA, just like 1332 guidance that the president's put forward now is a direct violation of the ACA. Again, it goes back to an ideology. The ideology I think that Arizona is saying is, look, people want to buy this junk. I use the term, you probably wouldn't. Let them. That's their personal responsibility. That's not the concern that we had in drafting the ACA was that people didn't know what they were getting into and they were buying these things and didn't realize it. And I still think that that's true, which is why we shouldn't be selling these things.
Well, and thank you, Mr. Pallone. And you're right, we do have a difference in opinion. I just believe that people know better than government. You're presuming that people just don't know, and I don't presume that. So thank you, sir. And I yield back my time.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask unanimous consent to put into the record the statement of administration policy that we've received, and also a letter from Administrator Seema Verma to Greg Walden.
Without objection.
Outlining many of these things that I brought up.
Without objection. Where are we? Let me just remind people that we're about to have a vote. We have 3 more witnesses. Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This will be quick. Mr. Pallone, thank you for your excellent leadership on this. My state, Maryland, has been using this waiver process, and we were able to reduce the cost of premiums by 13% in our state. And your legislation, as I understand it, protects the availability of the 1332 waiver for states that are engaged in trying to maintain truly equal comprehensive coverage for people. But would you just explain for me again how these junk plans came about and why they're such a threat to the waiver process if we don't legislate?
Well, because when we drafted the ACA, and this was with the support of the President Obama at the time, the concern was that somebody might somebody might lose their coverage, they might change their employer, whatever, and therefore they would like to have a short-term plan available for a limited period of time. I mean, at the most, it was 3 months. Oftentimes, it was just a few weeks or whatever. And that was it. But now, and so, the president now issued a regulation saying it can be for 3 years.
So people who are getting seduced by these junk plans or tricked by these junk plans are putting themselves in a very dangerous, risky position, because suddenly someone has cancer, someone needs hospitalization, or someone needs more extensive care, and they can't get it because they've been sold the junk plan. The minority party is making fun of the title. They came up with, I think, 7 or 8 other ideas for titles. Is H.R. 986 properly titled the Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act?
Absolutely, because that's, practically speaking, the people that are going to be hurt if this 1332 continues.
Yeah. Well, don't people with pre-existing conditions exist in all of the states? Why wouldn't all of us be for this?
Well, again, it's the same thing. In other words, when we did the ACA, we knew that within the individual market, a lot of people couldn't get insurance. That's why we had the subsidies, the tax credit. And we knew that a lot of people were being discriminated against because of pre-existing conditions and other things generally. So that's why we had these anti-discrimination provisions.
All right, well, look, I just want to thank you for really your exceptional leadership all the way through the Affordable Care Act. We know that Americans would not be protected for pre-existing conditions were it not for the ACA. And that was a partisan thing. The Democrats supported it and the Republicans opposed it. And the Republicans moved more than 60 times to destroy the Affordable Care Act, to abolish pre-existing condition coverage without replacing it with anything. And my memory is like the memory of the chairman of this committee. I don't remember any Republicans standing up for pre-existing condition coverage until they realized that the vast majority of the American people were for it. Still to this day, I don't understand how it's consistent with their philosophy. If their philosophy is everybody should just go out and get their own thing and let the market rule, then why don't you let the market rule with pre-existing condition coverage? But they looked at the polls and now they're scrambling to say they're on our side. I'm with you on this legislation, and I want to thank you for bringing it forward. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli? Yeah, we'll try to get as much as we can get done.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to ask for clarification on whether Mr. Perlmutter, by changing seats, gets to speak twice, but I hope that's not the case. Just a couple quick points based on some things I heard. First of all, just in terms of bona fides, there's a number of members who have served in the state legislature. I had the privilege of serving for 28 years in New York, 6 years as chair of the insurance committee. I also chair something called the Rochester Health Innovation Collaborative. But it reminds me that a lot of what we do, and what I remember doing as chair of the insurance committee, was balancing. You wanted to balance the comprehensiveness of care versus the cost. You add services, it does increase the cost of premiums, but you want to still make sure that you have essential benefits, which is what we came to under the Affordable Care Act, and each state was able to determine its essential benefit package without adding too much extraneous coverage, which would raise the cost and make it unaffordable. Something that Ms. Lesko said, which I found interesting, is the notion that people know best what they need in terms of coverage. But the truth is, insurance is by definition intended to deal with fortuitous events. Fortuitous not necessarily meaning good, it's just unexpected. Fortuitous. If it's not a fortuitous event, it's not insured. That's what insurance is for, so people can't know. My daughter was 29 years old, diagnosed with breast cancer. She shouldn't have had it. By every risk factor known to man, she should not have had breast cancer. We couldn't have counted on that. And if you had said to her at the beginning of that year, why don't you buy insurance coverage that doesn't have a mammogram, because the odds that you'll get breast coverage or breast cancer is so small. But it's fortuitous. You didn't know in advance that it happens. That's why we have insurance at all. I think there are many innovations which will generate real savings and improve care. Practice transformation. We did work that I continue to do in Rochester about embedding case managers, primarily nurse practitioners, in private practice, and to make sure that we can reduce the cost for chronic long-term care illnesses. Social determinants of health, obviously a big innovation that's going on throughout healthcare. Care coordination, telemedicine, telehealth, community-based care. The list goes on of innovations that actually improve healthcare and reduce premiums. However, innovation is not a magic word. Those of us who've served at the state legislature know some things work well, some don't, and just slapping a word on it doesn't make things real. And I think we use it too much. I do note that if you want to reduce costs, you can reduce utilization. Sometimes that means avoiding emergency rooms by good interventions. Sometimes it's just cutting people off from services. You can reduce services, reduce protections. That keeps people less insurance, less certainty, but it would reduce costs. Or you can reduce the population covered. This is a pretty simple and straightforward thing, it seems to me. There's waiver guidance. This doesn't change the waiver. It simply says the guidance which is renewed under the administration, which now says access, to your point, Mr. Chairman, access isn't the same thing as coverage. Having access, but maybe it's a little more costly than I want to pay for. So I buy a less expensive, a policy that has less coverage, but it would qualify under this new guidance. This simply says that's not allowable. The intention of the waiver is to help fully implement the Affordable Care Act and its protections, and to allow innovations that will allow you to more fully recognize the goals and the intentions of the Affordable Care Act, not to undo them, not to undo those protections. So the waiver will remain in place, and I do know, frankly, some states who chose not to use Medicaid expansion, Alabama's uninsured population, 10%, Alaska, 14%, Georgia, 13%, Massachusetts, 3%, New York, 6%, Pennsylvania, 6%. So states can do a great deal. Some states haven't, in my view, done nearly enough. Texas, 17% uninsured, 2017 numbers. So we don't want to undermine protections. We want to fully realize all the benefits of the Affordable Care Act, allow states to have that innovation. But this guidance is intended, frankly, to do something far different. And I'll leave with this, that I learned a long time ago that definitions matter, words matter. I had a woman call me once who had gone out of network for services for a very severely hurt son, and she was told, you have out-of-network coverage. She did have it, 20% of the coverage. She thought out-of-network coverage meant she was covered fully, but it didn't. She did have out-of-network coverage. Definitions matter. Definitions matter here, and it's very important that we pass this, and I hope that the Senate does take that, come to their senses, and realize that we have to give the administration some further guidance on what they're doing. So, thank you.
No other, I think we've exhausted all the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're free to go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We have another panel, Mr. King, Mr. Bobby Scott, Mr. Dunn, Mr. Austin Scott, Ms. Radewagen, Mr. Graves. We'll do one panel. So why don't we begin with Mr. King?
I'm here on the next bill.
Yeah, we're going to do it all at once. Trying to see if we get this going here. Mr.
Bobby Scott was.
When he comes back,
next, and they took
that's what we're going to just, Mr. King, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to hear the discourse in the previous discussion, and I present something that is actually very simple and concise. And it does this. In fact, I've heard some of the discussion here in the hearing but my amendment is very simple. It's a sense of Congress amendment that the majority of states had some protections in place for pre-existing conditions. And even if those protections were insufficient in our judgment, at least for all Americans with pre-existing conditions, the states are in a much better position than the federal government to determine how to effectively and adequately cover the respective populations. And I would note that as a former state senator, I chaired the Iowa State Senate State Government Committee, where we had oversight over our pre-existing conditions policy, which we called the high-risk pool. And so we've dug into this from the research side of it, and really come up with this, that there were only 4 states, and at the beginning of Obamacare, 10 years ago or so, that didn't have a policy in place. Some were fairly comprehensive, others not so much. But those 4 states that didn't have a policy were Alaska, Arizona, Delaware, and Nebraska. And so I just simply ask that my amendment be allowed to be debated on the floor so that we can get the facts into this discussion. And I would note that one of the gentlemen just a little bit ago made this statement that I think makes my case for me. He said, "We know that Americans would not be protected with pre-existing conditions were it not for the ACA." But the truth is, all but 4 states had a program, and that's the essence, Mr. Chairman, of my amendment. And I'd be happy to entertain any questions or comments, and I'd yield back.
Mr. Bobby Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment on the Appropriations Supplemental, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for the opportunity to testify in support of that amendment. I'd like to thank Congressman John Lewis and Congresswoman Barbara Lee for co-sponsoring the amendment with me. The amendment would provide $2 million to the 400 Years of African American History Commission, which was signed into law last year by President Trump. 2019 marks the 400th anniversary of 20 and odd enslaved Africans arriving at Port Comfort, Virginia in 1619. These slaves were the first documented Africans in the English colonies, and their arrival set the stage for a long history of oppression and hardship that Africans and African Americans would go on to endure through slavery, Jim Crow, legalized segregation, and the Civil Rights Movement. It would be a great disservice not only to African Americans but to all Americans if we failed to appropriately recognize this important upcoming milestone in our nation's history. Senator Tim Kaine and I had this goal in mind when we first introduced the bill establishing the commission in 2016. While grateful that the Congress finally passed the bill in 2017, it's unfortunately that the majority included language prohibiting federal expenditures for this commission. And that was not unreasonable at the time, but the Trump administration took nearly 10 months to appoint commissioners, and by the time they met, we were at the end of 2018, right before the shutdown started, and so they were effectively denied commissioners access to the Interior and Park Service staff to get information and answers on how they could actually fundraise in order to meet the 2019 mandate of the commission. I attended one of the meetings where it was clear that they did not know how to raise money consistent with the federal ethics laws. In past, similarly situated anniversary and commemorative commissions had no federal funding prohibition, but actually received generous funding. The St. Augustine 450th Commission that was in 2009 set aside $3.5 million and a 7-year duration. Jamestown 400th Commission provided such sums as needed. Additionally, although the United States Semiquincentennial Commission of 2016 passed without any allotment of federal funds, similar prohibition language, it was later appropriated hundreds of thousands of dollars in the recently enacted Consolidated Appropriations Act. On the other hand, 400 Years of African American History Commission has received no federal funding set aside to date and was given a more compressed timeline of only 2.5 years to complete its work. Much of the work of the commission could have been accomplished in the first year, was severely hindered by the lack of appointed commissioners. These constraints do not afford the same opportunity of this commission to be successful, and I have been informed by some of the commissioners that some of them aren't even attending meetings because their travel is not being reimbursed. With this important context in mind and the fact that we're almost halfway through 2019, I respectfully request that the committee rule my amendment in order so that the 400 Years of African American History Commission can have some funds to finally hire an executive director and other support staff to actually get up and running. For this commemoration to be successful, it requires more support and backing than they've presently received. Thank you for your attention.
Ms. Radewagen.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the Rules Committee for allowing me to testify on the effects Cyclone Gita had on American Samoa in February 2018 so as to provide an increase in nutrition assistance funds. First of all, I was there and experienced it firsthand. Steady 100-mile-an-hour winds and rain as much as 6 inches per hour recorded. Cyclone Gita ravaged American Samoa, resulting in a presidential major disaster declaration, which we are thankful for, as well as for all of FEMA's help. In the aftermath of Cyclone Gita, American Samoa submitted a plan to USDA which included data to support a request for supplemental nutrition assistance. The total amount of the governor's request to USDA was $26 million, of which only $500,000 was provided. About half of American Samoa's population live way below the poverty line. Most others are only marginally above it, and nearly 18,000 are classified as very low income. 1/3 of the people depend on backyard or subsistence farms, so Gita deprived them of their business income and the food with which they feed themselves as well as their families. Our Pacific territorial neighbor, the Marianas Islands, have the same population, but American Samoa has half the economic activity due to our remote rural location and a lack of tourism. So we have half their average income at less than $10,000 per year, plus a 50% higher unemployment rate at 16%, the highest in the nation. But we also have #1 Army recruiting station in the country per capita. These veterans and their families now need our help after helping the country so much. Our economy contracted 10% in the 2 years before Cyclone Gita, and an additional 10% since, so we've been in recession made worse by the storm. I believe the modest level of funding increase we're proposing for nutrition assistance is justified, though I understand there's limited funds, and I appreciate the committee's consideration of my amendment. I ask also to submit for the record a summary data sheet on damages prepared for the committee by American Samoa's Governor Lolo Molinga's administration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, thank you very much. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here on disaster relief, but I would like to, since my state of Georgia was mentioned, I would like to say one thing on the previous legislation. We have 159 counties in Georgia. Carriers cannot underwrite the individual, but they can underwrite the zip code. And over half of the counties that I represent, there is no choice in health insurance. And that is a very real problem for us, and I hope we're able to get to a solution on that. For today, I'm here with an amendment to H.R. 2157. Again, I appreciate the willingness of the majority to bring a disaster relief bill to the floor. In mid-October, the storm straddled Congressman Bishop and I's district from Georgia. It also hit Florida as well. It was a Category 5 hurricane when it hit. We have had tremendous losses to our crops and communities throughout our area, and I would tell you in the areas that I come from, and Congressman Bishop, agriculture is the genesis of the economy. If the farmers aren't making money, there's no money for the counties or the cities or the school systems. And I think the damage that's been done by not passing a bill in a timely manner is going to make our recovery significantly longer in what is one of the poorer areas of the country. So USDA has a little better than $1 billion left over from WHIP from the 2017 years. This bill is written to address future disasters, and it would allow the USDA to use the funds that are left over from 2017 for the 2000 and 2019 disaster years. With that, Mr. Chairman, I again appreciate your support and hope that this amendment can be made in order.
Thank you. Mr. Graves?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Mr. Chairman, the balanced budget, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 provided significant funding for disaster recovery for a lot of our challenges that we've experienced, including Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, that caused devastating impacts across the United States. Some of the funding that was provided in that bill is designed to provide recovery, long-term recovery. It also provides mitigation funds. Despite the fact that the law was enacted in February of last year, there were certain deadlines for certain portions of funds. There has not even been a Federal Register notice published for the mitigation funds provided in that bill. This is for long-term recovery, it's for resilience of these communities, and this helps to prevent future disaster funds. We have been working with HUD now for over a year, and I want to be clear. The same types of delays occurred under the previous countless administrations. This isn't a partisan thing. This has affected every administration. Personally, I don't think this program should be within within HUD, but here's the deal. We have 4 amendments we're working on that we filed. The amendments simply require that that there be a specific time frame that HUD act within to provide a Federal Register notice to states to know how they can administer the mitigation funds that were provided. Let me say it again, in February of last year. Number two, in October of last year, the Disaster Recovery and Reform Act became law. That law ensures that disaster victims that receive a loan from the SBA may also be able to receive a grant through HUD recovery funds. We have been waiting on guidance since October. In the case of Louisiana, it's holding up $230 million for 7,000 families. Same impacts in Texas, in North Carolina, in Puerto Rico, and other places. So once again, our amendment number 19 puts a backstop and requires publishing of the guidance. Lastly, we have a bipartisan amendment that we worked on the same issue, the similar issue with Congresswoman Fletcher, ourselves, Congressman Rouser, and Congresswoman Jackson Lee. It puts a 14-day timeline under which HUD will be required after enactment to publish the Federal Register notice that would then give the states the idea of how they can begin investing these funds in mitigation for their communities. So let me say it again. Two primary issues here. Number one is requiring within 7 days, amendment number 19, requiring within 7 days that HUD publish the final guidance from an October law that's going to release $230 million just in Louisiana. These are previously appropriated funds, no new funding. It'll also release funds in Texas, North Carolina, and Puerto Rico, likely Florida in the future. The second amendment, or the second issue, is amendment number 51 that's bipartisan, or amendment number 60 or 20 that we've done ourselves, and that also puts a backstop that requires that HUD publish Federal Register notice or guidance within anywhere from 7 days to 60 days after enactment of this. We've got to get these funds out in the community, and HUD really has not done a good job, and I want to say it again, under any administration in recent times in administering these disaster recovery programs. I think it's a little bit out of their lane, so I'd appreciate your consideration.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Thank you. My amendment, Amendment 46, opens FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation grant application process back up for fiscal year 19 to any state, territory, or federally recognized tribe that failed to submit an application for any reason for a period of 30 days once this disaster bill is passed. The entire goal of FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation grant program is to reduce the overall risks posed to our communities and protect them from future tragedies. These grants are incredibly important to prevent future losses before the disaster strikes and therefore reduce reliance upon disaster funding that will likely be passed this week. The communities I represent in Illinois right now are experiencing severe flooding, and they should not be punished because of the state's failure to complete an application on time. This amendment will give states like mine another chance to submit a completed application for pre-disaster mitigation grants and qualify for these important grants. This was not just isolated to Illinois. North Carolina had a similar issue where the state was not able to submit their PDM application for whatever reason. This amendment is bipartisan, and with the co-sponsorship of Alma Adams, my colleague from North Carolina, it's supported by members from multiple states. This is not a partisan issue. I appreciate my colleagues working together toward a fix and for highlighting the impact and severity of this issue on our local communities. I urge the chairman and ranking member to waive any points of order and make this amendment in order so the communities that my colleagues and I represent in Illinois and our friends in North Carolina can get the help they need to avoid future tragedies that cost taxpayer dollars. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you mind just moving to the next seat so Mr. Dunn can sit there and give his testimony?
Is that an option?
I move on to...
Is that like a promotion? Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and let me say it's a great pleasure to see my fellow Floridian here. Your courage and your strength is inspiring. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have 5 amendments. I'll go through very briefly each one. The first is Amendment 28, Air Force and Marine MILCON. Hurricane Michael flattened Tyndall Air Force Base 7 months ago. It's a rebuild that will take approximately $2.4 billion in military construction funding. This amendment takes the $700 million in MILCON for Tyndall up to $1 billion and allows for planning, design, F-22 relocation, F-35 bed down, and $300 million in funds to begin with the construction. The second part of that amendment addresses the Marine Corps base at Camp Lejeune. This is not my district, but sadly, Representative Jones passed away. It's his district, and I've adopted the Marines. Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune was devastated by Florence 8 months ago, even before Tyndall. It's expected to cost $3.1 billion to repair. My amendment increases the Marine Corps military construction funding from $115 million to $500 million, allowing them to get underway with their very, very sizable rebuild. And I think we all know that the more we appropriate now, the cheaper and more efficiently we can rebuild these vital missions. That's Amendment 28. Amendment 30, offshore patrol cutter. In my district, Eastern Shipbuilding builds our Coast Guard's offshore patrol cutters. They recently informed me that they expect a 6-month delay in the first hull delivery because of Hurricane Michael. Their facilities were badly damaged. My amendment requires the Coast Guard to simply provide a report to Congress on their strategy to mitigate any delays in the offshore patrol cutter contracts caused by Hurricane Michael. And this is one of the very highest, it is the single highest priority acquisition project for the Coast Guard. Currently, it's a 25 cutter acquisition program over 11 years. I can go on about how fine these cutters are, but in the interest of time, I will not. I am happy to take questions at any time. Amendment 33, Air Force O&M, it's operations and maintenance money. The Air Force is in critical need of operations and maintenance funding for both Tyndall Air Force Base and Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, which flooded just a few weeks ago. The Secretary of the Air Force has deferred 61 projects across 18 states throughout the Air Force enterprise as a result of running out of money, using those monies to pick up debris at Tyndall. Our delay in passing this supplemental has critically affected readiness in the Air Force. She said that she would have to stop rebuilding Tyndall as of May 1st if we didn't pass the supplemental. May 1st is passed, and the rebuilding at Tyndall has stopped. If it goes beyond May 15th, they will stop repairing airplanes. This is a readiness issue across the Air Force enterprise. It doesn't get any more serious than that. Got to have that. Amendment 36, timber and aquaculture. This amendment adds timber and aquaculture to the list of crops eligible for loss payments in this bill. Hurricane Michael devastated the North Florida and Alabama and Georgia timber industries. Estimates run as high as $3 billion worth of loss in timber. This accounts for the overwhelming majority, 87% of agricultural losses in Florida. This industry is vital to Florida. It's a $25 billion annual economic impact in our state. And across North Florida, 10% of all the workforce is involved in forestry, logging, and sawmill type operations. The livelihoods of these families, and many of these forests are 1, 2, 3, 400 acre pieces that represent the retirement funds and the education funds for these families. And they are bereft of their savings at this point. The timber was not eligible for loss payments in the 2017 WIP program. I understand that the issue's been raised. This amendment is a Clause 2 violation or legislating on an appropriations bill. I think it is not, as it's just to clarify. This amendment does not change any existing authorization program. It simply corrects an oversight in the current draft of the bill, in which 87% of our losses were timber. I think this is very straightforward, adding timber to trees. Our last amendment, Amendment 41, regards the FEMA trailers. I think we've all familiar with the famous FEMA trailers. This requires FEMA to produce a report identifying ways to lower cost and expedite the delivery of mobile housing units to hurricane victims. Hurricane Michael caused an unrivaled housing crisis in my district. Our city is sort of unique. We're 100 miles from the next city, whether you go east or west or north, so there's no rental properties right next door. We need housing on site so that people can stay there and rebuild. 7 months after our storm, many of my constituents remain homeless. They are sleeping in tents or in cars. The process to receive these FEMA trailers is just riddled with government bureaucracy and inefficiency, causing unnecessary delays. I have seen estimates that the FEMA is paying up up to $150,000 per trailer to actually get it placed on somebody's land. I have priced these trailers in my town. They're $19,500 plus taxes. We can save the government a lot of money on these things. And that consists.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. I have no questions. I hope and pray no one else has any questions here. Do you? Yes, Mr. Woodall.
I did have three statements to submit for the record.
Without objection, they're all in.
Statement from Mr. LaMalfa, Ranking Member Granger, and a letter from the Secretary of the Interior.
Without objection, I have a statement from Eddie Bernice Johnson and Anita Lowy, and without objection, they'll be inserted in the record. Thank you all for being here. That ends the hearing portion of the bill. We will now.
May I?
Thank you.
Just one more statement for the record.
Yeah, one more
From
statement.
Mr. Calvin.
Without objection, happily. Right. We are now, at this time, we're going to, the chair will maintain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Ms. Shalala.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee report a structured rule for consideration of H.R. 986, the Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act of 2019. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in Part A, the Rules Committee report accompanying the resolution. Each such amendment may be offered only in order printed in the report and may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment printed in Part A of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2 of the rule provides for consideration of H.R. 2157, the Supplementary Appropriations Act of 2019, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of the Rules Committee print 116-12 modified by the amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report shall be considered as adopted, and the bill shall be amended, shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions of the bill as amended. The rule provides that Clause 2E of Rule 21 shall not apply during consideration of the bill. The rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, and shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part C of the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
You've heard the motion from the gentleman from Florida. Are there any discussion or amendments? Mr. Cole.
Amendment, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. In a desperate effort to just get this over with one amendment, I'm offering an open rule on H.R. 986, 2157. We could all get out of here right away, Mr. Chairman. But we think clearly we've got some concerns with the H.R. 968, an effort to limit waivers. And frankly, as we heard, we have a lot of great ideas. I think the disaster package is a good one. I intend to vote for it, but I think it would be a lot better if we could add some of these suggestions we heard tonight.
Heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none. The vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Roll call. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? No. Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall?
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No. Clerk
Mr.
report the
Chairman,
total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
It is not agreed to. Any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Woodall, and I think they're holding the vote for us, so don't we can, Mr. Woodall.
I have an amendment to the rule to make an order.
No, they're not.
Number 22 to H.R. 986, offered by Mr. Flores. require the chief actuary at the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services to certify the bill will not increase premiums for qualified health plans. And also make an order and provide the necessary waivers to Amendment Number 6 to H.R. 2157, offered by Austin Scott of Georgia, which would allow the U.S. Department of Agriculture to utilize unused funds from the Wildfire and Hurricanes Indemnity Program to help with Hurricane Florence, Michael, and other
Heard
hurricanes.
the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Woodall Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Clerk will call the roll
Mr.
quickly.
Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall?
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Members not agreed to. Further amendments? Further amendments. Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule to make an order and provide the necessary waivers for Amendment Number 9 to H.R. 986, offered by Mr. Walden from Oregon, and for Amendment Number 59 to H.R. 2157, offered by Mr. Rogers.
You heard the gentleman, ladies' amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Lesko Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Roll
Mr.
call,
Hastings.
President Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala?
No.
Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Members not agreed to. Are there any other amendments or discussion? Hearing none, the question is now on the motion for the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Shalala. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
No.
You chair, the ayes have it.
Roll call.
Roll call.
Mr. Hastings? No. Mr.
Aye.
Mr. Hastings, aye. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin? Aye. Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, aye. Ms. Shalala? Aye. Ms. Shalala, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess?
Ms. Burgess.
Mr. Burgess, no. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman,
Clerk
aye.
report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Motion is agreed to. Ms. Shalala
9
will carry.
yeas, 4 nays.
Ms. Shalala will carry this for the Democrats, and
Mr. Burgess.
Mr. Burgess will carry for the Republicans. Hearing is adjourned. We're done.
Could have saved us all that.
Yep, I'll get everything.